Thank you everyone for joining. I'm Rafat Marzoub. I'm the director of the Khan, which is a partner in OpenScape, a transnational platform for artistic and curatorial exchanges initiated by Rezo. OpenScape is materialized in partnership with 9 international partners and is rolled out through public meetings and gatherings roughly every 2 months. The Khan is currently hosting the 4th main topic in OpenScape programming throughout this month. Prototyping cultural practices aims to bring together artists and institutions that are testing new ideas, methods, and systems towards building fairer, more generative or provocative cultural practices in their context. I'm happy to welcome our participants today for the first conversation. So Yazan Khalili is the co-founder of Radio Al-Hara, an online radio broadcasting from Palestine. Vikram Iyengar and Dana Roy are co-founders of Pickle Factory, a dance foundation based in India. I hope this conversation offers a space of mutual learning for all of us in community building, radical leadership, political engagement through the culture sector. There will be 3 more encounters with different participants before a town hall meeting happens on February 28th, where we all gather to join the discussion in a more open, questioning way. Until then, all these conversations will be logged on the OpenScape website. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Yazan, Vikram, and Dana. I'm going to leave it to you, and I'm going to enjoy. Thanks.
Thank you, Rafat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rafat.
Hi, Dana and Vikram.
Hi.
Hey, hello.
Hello,
Nice.
hi.
Email.
Sorry?
Nice to put a face to the email.
Yes, definitely. Also, I like it that we are meeting publicly, but for the first time. Like,
Yeah.
usually
And
there is.
it's a strange sort of pandemic public meeting because we don't know if anybody's out there at all.
No, I don't know. But that's something in the radio. Like, I have to say, doing the radio, we never knew. It's very hard to know if there are people listening or not. You are just shouting
sending it out,
the online wilderness and hoping that there's someone listening. But by time, I think, like what happened in our radio, like by time people, there were.
You got responses and things later, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, like they were listeners, but then we knew them because they began sending us tracks to play or mixes or sound bits or audio material that we began playing. But at the beginning, it was totally just like we opened up a radio and like now we'll just let's it be streamed on YouTube and hope.
But that's, I think, with all of the arts, that's what you have to do. You have to try, you have to leap, and then it might stick, it might not stick, and you hope somebody is listening and wanting more of it. And then sometimes you're very pleasantly surprised. Yeah.
Totally. But I wonder if this recording will stay. I wonder, maybe we need to ask if it stays on YouTube or it disappears after we finish our. Because this is like this was like the internet as an archive, no? Like it always leaves trace.
I think it stays on YouTube. I think on any of the social media things, that's both the sort of the pros and the cons of it. That anything you put up there refuses to go away ever.
Yeah. On Radio Al-Hara, this was a big, huge discussion. Like, do we keep an archive of the material or we don't? Finally, we decided not to. Like, we really if you are, we called it part of our collective listening practice. You are either there to listen to what's on the radio collectively, or you miss it out.
Yeah.
So you cannot do this kind of nice program, I will listen to it later. Alone. Like you have to do it collectively. And this is
which is a very interesting thing, because I think that's the question mark that has come about live performance now that, especially pandemic, everything on Zoom, and this whole thing is, do you have a recording? Can I see the performance later? And the ephemeral temporality of live performance sort of disappears. And of course, recently, we're always being asked to document a performance, etc. And I find myself, looking at things because we have to take pictures. And the moment of the live performance is never going to be captured in those pictures. The feeling of that movement in that moment is I'm missing it because I'm trying to take the photograph, but at the same time, the photograph is not doing it justice. So sometimes you think, yes, the archiving is important to say that it happened, but to experience it there and to have that habit of listening and experiencing and watching and immersing, is something that I'm so glad that you guys are having that similar sort of discussion.
Totally.
With radio. Yeah.
I think what you are saying is very existential, I think, for many of the artistic practices nowadays, and also existential also in the way that art can allow for freedom of speech or not. Meaning, I've been noticing it lately, like, because everything is recorded, because everything is has a trace, so it loses its temporality. Like, there are things that you can say in the live, or you can do in the live performance, that belongs to the now and here, and after it ends, it disappears. It doesn't leave this kind of traces that stays and loses this idea of the temporality,
Yeah.
And now, like, if you in a Zoom meeting discussing something, speaking something, that has some political relations to it, because it leaves all these traces.
And I think sometimes the trace is also misleading, because we tend to feel that everything you see on camera is everything, but the context of a room might be very different to what you see on camera, even though you feel that I've understood the whole picture, which is very often that's not the case, right? Where an audience in a room may feel something differently, and therefore certain conversations and things might come out. And you're absolutely right that temporality plays such a
in sort of documentation of live performance, which is what sort of what we do. We don't do the documentation, but sort of in the realm of live performance, often the way it's documented is you see the performance, but you don't really often see the audience. And then of course, there's no way even for the camera to give you any sense of actually what the audience in that moment is experiencing. You become a secondary audience to a diminished version of the piece, watching it online or watching it on video, because that liveness is gone and the immediacy of when it was performed is gone. And the third thing is there is no way for you to enter those two things, because the camera is never focusing on the audience as well. So that these you can't sort of document energy in that sense.
No.
So that becomes and also when we've been asked both. This is an ongoing discussion internally, and also, as Dana was saying, about how do we document things for whoever our partners may be or funders may be, and what is it that you put out there? What is the documentation that you do? How do you also do documentation sensitively, so that it's not a camera in your face? Because once you do that, you've ruined it. That's also why we don't really encourage the press, if they come at all, to bring their cameras with them.
I had so many fights with these journalists that consider them having the best position to put the camera is more important than the people experiencing the performance.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a live sense, because they want to put the camera here in the middle. It's big, it's taking place, and they kill the whole, because for them. But because for them, they are, this documentation is more important than the experience.
Absolutely.
And actually, to say, there was a moment where there was an event where they were reading a letter from a prisoner. Anyway, and the one who's reading was outside of the room, and they wanted only the sound to be there. And the cameraman that was coming to cover the event began screaming in the middle of the event, "Bring him in! What do I film? Sound? I'll bring him in." I swear, like this kind of the feeling of the power that the idea of the documentation now has over the experience is something to be actually noticed, because in like many of the theater plays, for example, that I've seen them on TV. So there is a history of documenting and filming a performance, a theater, this history connects to a way of filming and cutting and repeating, and sometimes they do it without the audience, sometimes there's the audience. So there is a history of it, and now this history has been deleted to a kind of documenting that it just like wants to that disregards the experience itself. And it's amazing that I'm beginning to see, maybe now in relation to the radio practices that are based to be online, that we are trying to be in these two kind of positions in between what social media is and it's very individualistic relation to temporality, time, archive, etc., and classical media with its centralized approach, but centralized production, but very temporal. Like you can either listen to the news now or to the program now, or you don't. And there's kind of collective listening here, and maybe and a kind of individualistic relation to the social media, and what kind of information do you get as an individual? And I guess this search for communal spaces, so communal experience, at least in Radio Al-Hara, this is what we have been discussing a lot. How do we create a communal experience of our programs, of the productions of the community, because we don't produce our own. The community shares its, so shares is also a very social media. So they share their production with us, and and in a central sense, centralized approach, we program it, but then it can be only experienced collectively. So these kind of waves, I think, it's not an answer to anything, but it comes out of a trial to create a space in between communal media, between social media and centralized media.
That's also very interesting, because when you think of the word community, a community, you would find those moments coming together, say several people around maybe a campfire, or several people around a cup of tea, so the moments of community are actually very temporal. And of course, a sense of community is a longer feeling thing, but this moment of listening to a radio program together, or watching a live performance together, or so actually it's a link of all of these temporal moments that I suppose builds that sense of community. Even when I'm thinking of the spaces that we create, which are very temporal, they pop up in a certain space, exist for that space and time, and as much as a picture might capture how it looks, it will not capture the feel of the space, and it exists for that community for that amount of time and then disappears. So when we are building community, then you're building several temporal experiences over time, and that collectively therefore becomes something else.
And also, you're not building one community, you're building you're building so many different kinds of communities depending on what work you're putting out there. You could choose to go really niche and say, this is the only kind of community I want, which is fine. Or you could be as plural and diverse and as you like. Depends on who you are and what you want to do. So this coming together as a repeated thing, and the fact that every time it repeats, it actually comes together stronger, even though the people may be different. But then the communities may be different, the individuals who make up that collective experience may be different. Every time it comes together, it sort of reiterates something which is a little bit stronger, it sort of underlines a basic ethos in a much more, the more you repeat something, the more it gets ingrained.
Yeah.
So that that engraving of a certain value, of a certain belief system, of a certain
and then a culture forms around that.
Exactly, yeah. So how do you from building temporal moments, you're getting to building communities, and then those communities together, because of the temporal moments they spend together, then build a kind of culture and a way of thinking and believing and seeing. I mean, it's a huge, very long process. I think we've covered the history of the universe, but
Totally, but this is, I think, totally, it is a very long, very kind of say establishing process. Like, you cannot actually do it without going through this very long process that doesn't necessarily produce a result. It's not about the end, the result, no, like this kind of obsession that we have, in many of the, in the last, I think, 30 years, like a proposal that already
As an output.
Then a process that wants to reach that output and disregards the whole
KPIs are and all that. Yeah.
And this is this building up of communal relations goes beyond the result itself, or the finality of the proposal, no, like because both time and product, that's what the proposal wants, to be a product that's done within a certain amount of time. And this is also part, just to come back to speaking about, like, in Radio Al-Hara, this is, we don't apply for any funds. We just, we are fighting the need to apply and trying to keep it as much process-based rather than result-based. Because I'm personally an artist, and I have experienced so many proposal processes where you apply, and then you have the time, and you have to submit, blah 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 blah. And in this project, we are in this platform, infrastructure, I don't know what to call it. This is something that we are trying to negotiate all the time between us as a group. How do we make it process-based, or keep it against all the drives towards
it's all the consumerist pressures.
There's so much attractions in, like, okay, let's apply, let's get the, well done, let's have some money or something, which I'm not saying good or bad, because we are here, each one of us has a different job, and then we can live out from different things, but I think there is, and while working on these kind of the idea of the communities, the idea of platforms where there is a temporality for the project, but there is a kind of continuity in the places and the infrastructures that we build, which I think are very important for communal movements, like to have an infrastructure.
And the platform being a place, of course, of that meeting point, that is so important, because you might be sharing ideas in diverse ways, in your own silos, but unless a platform is there to bring you together, to have something new develop together, it doesn't happen. And I think, from what we're hearing of Radio Al-Hara, and then, of course, in a different way, what Pickle Factory has been doing is this, you don't have the infrastructure for a community that clearly needs it. How do you create that space? And it is a process, right? It's not like, okay, this is our end goal. We've got here, this is it. Absolutely.
Also from our experience, when we started Pickle Factory 2017-18, we had an idea of this is who we're doing it for. and it's actually really been a huge journey for us to actually see as we are creating a community. The fact that, when we started Pickle Factory, the word community wasn't really part of our thinking so much, but then how it became part of our thinking is a journey for us. And then also to see that, we thought what we were doing is geared towards this community, but then the people who actually come and join you may be very, very different. It's not to say that that community that you thought of doesn't come, but then you get all sorts of other people, very different backgrounds coming and supporting you for reasons that you could not imagine because you were not them. And that is, that's very rewarding. It's very educating, really. It's very humbling as well. To see that there are people, just joining in for different reasons, and they may not be the reasons that you started with, but that they have their own reasons to throw their hat in the ring, and that just becomes a greater celebration of community and of conversation. So, in fact, for the first time when we did our spaces, for the first time we called something a space for community was last November. And we worked with a local, I won't go into the history of Durga Puja now, it's a mammoth festival in Calcutta, goes across religion and society and politics and economics and everything. It's a huge public art display, and very neighborhood run. There's no centralizing. But the first time we worked with one of these neighborhood clubs, and why they were doing it and why we were doing it are probably very, very different reasons. But the fact that we created something together and therefore got a very different kind of vibe, a very different kind of demographic, which, as I said, was just very rewarding, very educational. It made us rethink our own practices and assumptions. It brought people, some of the audiences that we already had, to a very different part of the city. It generated new audiences who then came to know about us, and we came to know about them. So this sort of functioning at various levels and these exchanges that you generate because you're creating something together, and creating something together, which as you were saying, is not product, it's a process. Yes, in that you have moments of, we will now watch this, or we will now talk about that. Yes, but you're creating, how does one say, you're creating almost a bazaar of experience, which is really,
And I think, taking from what Vikram was saying, which is very interesting, that of course you're not expecting certain certain members of different communities to be interested, and when they are interested, then you realize that you sort of also then start creating experiences keeping that in mind. So there's this constant evolution and this constant give and take. As new people are interested, then you think, what will help feed that particular interest? So and create spaces where they can the exchange that they need as well happens. So I think whether it's a neighborhood community or a community of younger dancers or older dancers or experimenters or people who maybe would not have this performance like this happen so close to them and make it so accessible to them. It just was really rewarding because and that again, like, it changed how we would normally do things. If normally all our performances are ticketed, but we're now in a space where we feel this interest, from these young boys in the neighborhood who want to come and paint with us because all the painters are painting and things. But of course they can't afford like a 500 rupee ticket. So we change, you change the thing and say, okay, pay as you can, just, come and be part of it. And it becomes so warm and loving and welcoming. And they have already contributed with whatever they can, in kind, like painting on the walls or whatever it is. And then, of course, they come and experience the performances and they're so gripped by it. So that has been really immensely rewarding to see how it can grow and grow and grow in ways that you wouldn't imagine.
Yeah. Like, what we call it, we keep saying we are building the plane while flying it. And
yes.
This is really something, but you are saying exactly something that I feel like in Radio Al Hara and in different now projects or communities that I'm part of, like this ability to always reflect on the process itself, to learn from it. It's where no one is coming with a like a pre-given kind of a structure that is, this is it, this is what we are doing, and you either fit to it or you are out. And there's this ability to always move and stop, look, understand it, question it, doubt it, critique it, and then move again. Like, and this is, I think in general, like these kind of approaches to cultural practices nowadays are very, what do you call it, generative? Like they are pushing against a certain cultural practice that was established in the, I would say, last 30, 40 years, that made the institution very, kind of a rock.
Stodgy.
Yeah, like this is how things should be, and change is very hard. There's a long process of hierarchy within the cultural practices or the cultural infrastructure that makes it unable to approach culture culturally, and what I think many of the artists are doing now, and cultural practitioners, that we're all engaging not only in the cultural practice, but in the cultural infrastructure. Like the infrastructure itself is our cultural practice. Like this is what
I really like how you put it, how to engage with culture culturally, because we're engaging with, I mean, infrastructure for culture cannot be separate from the way culture sees itself and the organic nature of culture. And I think across the world, it's there are structures put in place which are not nimble enough to deal with. In a sense, culture is extremely promiscuous. It'll do what it likes, and it's very unpredictable. And once you put a structure in place, then you're canceling out flexibility and and
then it starts to die.
And then it starts to die, and it starts to become, oh, I know what's coming. And the magic of having a communal cultural experience of delight and discovery is already gone, because before you step in, 50% of what you're going to experience. So that, how does one strike that balance? Because of course, as we've already said, you can't do it without infrastructure. But how do you make the infrastructure serve the culture rather than the culture serve the infrastructure?
I'm totally, I think one of the false accusations that institutional culture has produced in, I'm not sure if I'm using the right words, but in that if you don't have these very rigid infrastructures, you will not have cultural practices, or that the society will not be able to come together. And I think part of what the contemporary art practices that are focusing a lot on infrastructural work is that to show that infrastructures are not what have been ideologically produced as something very static, as something very closed in a way. But infrastructures themselves can be fluid in a way, that they allow fluidity, they allow movement, but they also can move and be infrastructure and be open and accessible. And this is something that I think now the new challenges of art practices is not only to critique existing cultural structures, but to actually produce them. To produce it and to give it as an example. Like I think, of course, we're a big group in Radio Al Hara, but like for me, when I look at it, I see it as an example. as something that one can speak about, engage with, do it, and understand it at the same time. And this is a very important, I think, move within cultural practice nowadays, because if we're stuck in the kind of the leftist approach to critique, which is, like we are able to critique through theory what we see wrong in the power structure, then we are unable to engage communally or culturally, because culture is very much about practice. So we need to find this kind of balance between cultural practices that produce critique and theoretical critique. And that's why it's about practicing and understanding at the same time what we are doing.
Yeah, and as you say, one feeds into the other, and then it's this cyclical, well, not cyclical, it's more like a spiral, because you keep moving to the next and the next and the next iteration of things. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
There's one other thing that I'm finding actually quite interesting, just talking to you, that this term communal experience, I think the word communal now has, at least in India, and I'm sure in other parts of the world as well, has become such a contested term. It's become about division rather than bringing people together. There is a huge need to reclaim that word as well, and to say that, language also evolves, it's also culture. But to say that it has this meaning as well, and this meaning is generative, is constructive, is human, and this other meaning is just the opposite of all that. So I think that how we use the words and what words we choose to describe ourselves and the work we do is also, it is in a sense, it's a political choice in a sense, I think.
Definitely. But maybe it's about which language do you choose and how do we practice this language? So I think this is, it's very important what you are saying, because many times there are words that become, maybe like also in contemporary art for sure, like in the last, I've been in this word for like, I don't know, 15 years, and every now and then there's a word that comes and takes over the imagination of the practice, and then slowly you begin to see this kind of concept being overused and used and becomes totally degenerative in many ways. And I think, like now, if we're using a certain language, the question is how do we practice that language in a way that it goes beyond the meaning. So it's not about what does communal mean, but more like how communal creates social relations in the community. Yeah. And that then, if it changes the word, and then we change the concepts, but still what is left of this movement stays within the society.
So it goes back to what you were saying about process. So the word becomes a verb rather than a noun or an adjective. It's something that is constantly defining itself as it goes along.
Yeah, and it must, otherwise it just becomes like a representative thing.
It becomes a label. Yeah. Super. So, I wanted to ask you also, because for us, the live experience is very different, because the people are there, and which is why the pandemic was such a disaster, because for 2.5 years we couldn't really do anything. But for radio, and for radio which is talks about collective listening and everything, what has that experience been of you're listening alone but you're listening together, and how some sort of texture of what that experience could be,
It's interesting to me that I think it was also born in the pandemic, right?
Yeah, it's we're a pandemic
Pandemic baby.
pandemic baby, totally. I think us and many of the comrade radios, we were born in the pandemic. It's like a generation of the pandemic. The pandemic for us was, when it was established, we were just like, before that we were friends, and we're still friends, but we wanted to do things together, but the problem was that we live in different places, so it was very hard to work together. And when the pandemic happened, it allowed for the internet to the idea of working online became not only possible, but the only possibility. And therefore, there was this model of Radio Al Hayy in Beirut, and we kind of just contacted them, and we said we want to do a radio, and it's a very simple formula. The thing with the pandemic and the radio and the collective listening in it is that I don't know if you've seen the radio. It's just a play button and the name of the track and the chat. And this chat allowed people to sense a feeling of community, because you are there, you can chat, you can speak to each other. It's focused on the sound, meaning that it's not something you need to be totally immersed in. It's not like visuals or video, where you have to, so you can put it in the background, you can put it, also listen to it, or while you are doing other things. And it was live, meaning that, again, pandemic, people are staying home, but it was live, meaning that you can be on doing things online, because that's what people began only, being on online. But it created a sense of community through the possibility of chatting, commenting on what's being played. I know for a fact that there are friendships that were made on the chat, and the chat is something super interesting, because this is something that maybe growing up in the time when the internet was coming in, chat was something that's totally a living space. And but this chat was happening also as a public space. So it's not, I'm not only chatting to you as a friend, because that's how now chatting happens, but it is a chat, meaning that you write to everyone who is on the platform. So this created this kind of feeling of the live, of the now and here. And again, because people are sending their tracks and their sound and audio pieces, so people comment on it, and you can hear what people think of it. There were live, you not only send things pre-recorded, but you can do it live as well. And the live was something very special, because it took us back to a time where, like these, what the audience request.
Yeah.
It really became like that. Like, you can be playing some music, and then people are chatting and say, "Oh, why don't you play this song and that song?" And they send it to you. And that's why there was a kind of really live, and it was a neighborhood. Radio Hara also means the neighborhood's radio.
Yeah.
And for us, none of us come from media background, zero. So for us, it was also something that surprised us, and we just, because I think we didn't have an experience with it, we managed to go along with it without trying to put it within a certain form. So it was teaching us, it was leading us as much as we were also leading it, this kind of. And then we came up with this idea of bringing closer the producer and listener. So the listeners can be the producers, and the producers can be the listeners. So there's not this kind of very hierarchical relation between who's producing and playing on the radio and who can listen, like in classical radio. So there's a kind of a democracy of power relations. Yeah, we are still discovering it now. After the pandemic, like oh shit, the pandemic was good. Let's keep it for the radio. But it opened up in different ways. We also began doing some live performances, and people began doing things in different locations with Radio Al-Hara. It was a big. It was used a lot in the time of upheavals around the world too. That in Palestine, in Iran, in Ukraine. Also, people began using the Radio Al-Hara as a platform to broadcast things that are not that cannot be deleted, like in social media, because usually social media is very scary of how it can. You know, there's like for Palestinians, for example, like. Social Facebook and Instagram closes accounts for Palestinians that are trying to document what's going on. And so Radio Al-Hara and other communal radios become kind of a space where these voices can be expressed. Of course, they are not social media. They are not, scaled up as big as the social media, but they work on a different kind of network of radios and sounds.
And therefore becomes a platform that people can use, people can express, and absolutely,
Scales up and scales down. It builds up and also it scales up, meaning that it creates a network of radios that come together and begin mirroring each other. And then when things are calm, they become smaller again.
It is interesting also because clearly there is a need to express in a particular way, and to have a space like that, which, as you say, is not cast in stone. It's not something that, it can come back to bite you. That is I'm also thinking, I'm relating it to our situation here, where a lot of our young dancers and things don't have spaces to perform simply because the infrastructure is not there. And one of the things that happened sort of organically in the space in Nutundol, because it's a neighborhood community space, is, a dance jam. You come and you express, it happens, it shifts. Nothing is pre-planned necessarily. And the moment evolves and becomes what it is, and then sort of dissolves and moves away. But it's created just for that moment, and it becomes such a special thing, because it's not. I think also nowadays, because we're so caught in our own worlds, we look at our own entertainment separately, we look at our social media separately, that I think people in some ways become more disconnected from each other. So when you have platforms for community, where people can express together, all of that, or people can come and just dance together or chat together, I think it's becoming a rarer and rarer organic thing. Whereas, like earlier, you would find many more people, say, at the coffee houses and chatting and things. We do still have that, but somehow it's become less and less and less. So when there's a call to say, okay, we're doing this, a lot more people, I think, value that. And I think especially during the pandemic, there was definitely a sense that those spaces were missing, spaces to just be together and interact, feed off each other's energies.
And also, earlier what you were saying about things leaving traces, and that the traces having the potential to have quite a negative impact. But when things like this happen in a live kind of situation, which is not online, there are traces that are left, but those traces really cannot have a negative impact unless what happened was terrible. But if there is this, creative and celebratory explosion of energy, that space retains that energy in some way. And then when you go back to the space for something else, that space then has that energy for you to feed off. Whether you realize it or not, it's there. And that I suppose is what, going back to the thing of the little temporal moments that we create, because you keep creating them, you're creating layers of, what's the word I'm looking for? You're creating layers of very positive energies, which then sort of keep adding to create something that's, much greater than the sum of its parts. And we never know what that is, because we're always in process of making it. It's never finished. So
yeah. Super. Yeah. Spaces and places. Yeah.
So speaking of places, where are you based?
Now I am in Amsterdam.
So which is why you were at CET. I was wondering why you were in CET. So
yeah, now I'm here I'm doing PhD.
okay.
Not the happiest thing to do. But yeah, I'm doing it.
Yeah. I'm sure there are many structures that you're going to have to follow to do a PhD.
All about fitting in structures, I think. And you are based both in Calcutta.
Both of us.
Yeah.
I hope it's getting
Come.
late.
You must come. And you
Allah,
must come during Durga Puja.
I would love to. I came once to India, to Delhi. I didn't like it, but I heard it's not the best city.
Yes, it isn't. Come here.
Yeah, maybe this dissing of Delhi should not go live online, but
صح, I forgot. See, like these are the traces.
these are the traces.
No, I mean, like it's nice, like you go inside, but in general, it's a huge, wide streets, like, very hard to navigate as for like if you're coming. I was there for a week or so. So the scale is huge for human.
It's Delhi is huge for even us who are used to hugeness in terms of cities, but Delhi is really at another level.
But you come to Calcutta and you will also get lost here, because but it will get pleasantly lost, because there's all these lovely little gullies that you can discover things in different corners, and so you might get lost, but you might be very happy.
Sure, I will. I was like, many things were like amazing, but it was very hard to navigate.